15.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you tonight about this long walk, this big adventure I had in 1995, which really began in one way on a December day in 1994. I was living in Minneapolis, and there had been a blizzard. And I went to an outdoor store called REI to buy a shovel. I was going to buy a little foldable shovel because I needed to dig my truck out. And I was standing in line waiting to pay for the shovel, and just to kill time, I glanced at a book on a shelf nearby, and I grabbed it off the shelf. It was a book called The Pacific Crest Trail, Volume 1, California. And I'd never heard of the trail, but I turned it over and I read this one little paragraph that described what it was, a trail that went from the Mexican border, where Mexico borders California, all the way up a few miles into Canada, along the crest of the Sierra Nevada mountain range and the Cascade Range through California, Oregon, and Washington. And it was one of those moments in my life that you sort of stop and notice because you actually feel. I felt the moment right here. I felt something sort of open in me. And something spoke to me. I felt that this trail I'd never heard of moments before. I recognized right away that it was something that was really grand and magnificent and beautiful and significant. And it was essentially everything that was the opposite of what I felt myself to be at that moment in my life. I had really, that day that I needed to go dig out my truck, it was true that I really needed to dig myself out too. I guess, at this place in my life that I think, very much now I can look back and see very clearly that it was like the bottom point of my life. And what had happened about 3.5 years before that is my mother had died really suddenly of cancer. She was 45, and we were both seniors in college, and she got what we thought was a cold, and 7 weeks later she was dead of advanced stage lung cancer. And it was one of those things that I was young enough that it had never occurred to me, essentially, that my mother would die. And she was really my only parent. And those of you in the room who have lost somebody who was essential to you, who was really that essential person, know what I mean when I say that, the world as I knew it ended the day my mom died. And it was a different world without her. And so I stumbled forward into that world, trying to make it work, and also ultimately realizing that I couldn't, or at least I believed I couldn't. And I spun into essentially a self-destructive kind of grief that was compounded by the fact that I was simply, young. I was in my 20s, and I was in the midst of this moment anyway that we all have to experience when we're trying to grow up and trying to figure out who we are. And I couldn't figure out who I was without that person. I didn't have a dad, and my family fell apart in the wake of my mom's death. And so I did all kinds of things. I was, wildly promiscuous with men and women and all kinds of people, just men and women. Nothing else. And I got involved with heroin. I met this guy who was sort of becoming a junkie, and I sort of, started down the path of becoming a junkie too. And I knew that none of these things were the person I really was inside. But I think in some ways I was, proving my love for my mom by refusing to live without her, refusing to thrive. And now I have 2 little kids. I have a 7-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I know that the only thing I want for my kids is for them to thrive, no matter what happens. That's what I want for my kids. And I think it was at that moment that I was in that store holding that guidebook when I felt that thing inside of me, that I realized that I had failed my mother. I had not only failed myself, I had failed my mother. And I couldn't live with that anymore. And I knew I had to figure out a way that I was going to go into the world as the person that she had raised me to be. And so I decided to go for a long walk on this trail. And at the time, I was living in Minneapolis. I was a waitress and a writer, which meant I was a waitress. And so I was writing at every chance I got, and when I wasn't like having sex and shooting heroin, and waiting tables. And I would wait tables and save my money, and every week I would go back to this store, and I would say, I'm going to take this trip. I'm going to go by myself. I'm going to hike for about 3 months, about 100 days, and I need stuff for this trip. And they would happily sell me, all kinds of stuff. And I shut down my life in Minneapolis. I was married at the time to someone I loved, dismantled everything, and very unoriginally went west, traveled west to find my new life. And I went to this little town of Mojave, California. And in the months preceding this, I had to do things like dehydrate food and prepare these resupply boxes that I would mail myself at different stops along the way. And the stops along this trail are not, towns so much as they are often just like a gas station or a bar or a ranger station. And I addressed these boxes full of things I would need. And I settled everything. And I got myself to the town of Mojave, essentially hitched a ride, and was left in the parking lot of this place called the White's Motel. And all I had was my pack and all the stuff that I'd bought for my trip. And I checked in to the motel, and I piled everything onto the bed. And I looked at it all. It was this gigantic pile. And it was really only then, that was that moment. It was that was the day one of this long trek I was going to take. I looked at all this stuff, and I realized, that I'd never gone backpacking before, which was, I realized really in a profound way. And, I had gone hiking. I was a hiker, and I had, so in some ways I had sort of convinced myself that this day hiking would prepare me for this backpacking. And I was really quickly about to learn that, it's kind of the equivalent of like, babysitting twins for an afternoon and giving birth to twins. They're not comparable undertakings whatsoever. So, I packed this pack for the first time and found that all this stuff that I had bought didn't all fit in the pack, and so I had to, lash a lot of things to the outside of the pack. And I also remembered that essentially I had really sort of just begun to hike my hike in just a place that I had essentially chosen randomly, the Mojave Desert. And it sounds really cool, doesn't it? Wouldn't you want to begin in the Mojave Desert if you were going to walk for 3 months? And, but what that meant, it really had great consequence to me on that first day, because it meant that it turns out there's, very little water in the Mojave Desert. And I'm from Minnesota, which maybe you don't know what that means, but it's like there's a lake, every 50 feet in Minnesota. It's called the land of 10,000 lakes, where I come from, and Mojave Desert not so much. And so I had to carry, just that first day that I was setting out, I had to lash 24.5 pounds of water onto my pack, which I don't know what that is in stones or whatever, but it's a lot. And what happens, so I get everything, and I go to, then it's time to leave. I can't delay anymore, and I can't lift my pack. And I couldn't even begin to lift it. It wasn't that it was just sort of heavy. It was that it was actually unliftable. Like, I could lift pretty much anything in sight. I think all of you, I couldn't lift that pack. And this was the first problem because, I was in an air-conditioned motel room, and I was trying to set out for an 1,100-mile hike in the wilderness. And it was really the first moment that, I just thought, okay, well, I have this choice. I could stop or go forward, and really stopping before I set out was never an option, because I came to this moment. It was like my own personal crocodile initiation. And I came to this moment that the one thing I couldn't do was fail. Like, I could fuck up in all kinds of ways, but I could not fail. And so I got this pack attached to me. I sat down on the floor, and I attached it to me, and I did this thing, this embarrassing thing that I won't demonstrate for you because I haven't had enough to drink. But I rocked back and forth essentially and got myself onto my hands and knees and did a deadlift, and I couldn't stand up. I was like this, and the pack was horribly, awfully, I had to cinch it very tightly to my body just so I could walk. And I did. I hitched a ride 10 miles to where the trail crossed a highway, and I began to walk, or sort of, do whatever that movement is that I could do underneath that pack. And within, there was this first moment where when you prepare for a trip like that, it's like, okay, here I am. I'm on the Pacific Crest Trail, this thing. And, I'd been planning for months. And I should say that in addition to the planning, I hadn't, stopped any of the sort of ridiculous things I'd been doing. I do think that I'm the only person who's ever set out on a long-distance backpacking trip having shot heroin 48 hours before. So I prepared, only a little bit for this. And so I'm out there, and within about 5 minutes, I realized that, this is hell, and I want off, and there's absolutely no way that I can do this. And I nonetheless, just kept going. I was terrified. I was in, these desert mountains with everything around me. It was sharp and jagged, and all the wind was rattling. Everything was brittle and sounded like a rattlesnake to me. And sometimes it actually was a rattlesnake. And in that first week, for the first 8 days of my trek, I didn't see another human being. And so I wanted to be alone on my hike, but I didn't know I would be that alone. And it was really too this, I had put the wrong kind of gas in my stove, and so I couldn't cook any of the dehydrated food that I was carrying. I had really underestimated my ability to move forward quickly, and was way behind schedule instantly. And also everywhere that my pack was making contact with my body, it just had rubbed my skin clean off. And so I was just, literally bleeding from my shoulders and my hips, and my feet were killing me. And in the midst of this, underneath all of this, I was feeling, is there the picture of me with, this is me in like the first week or two of my trek. It's actual dirt on my face, I think. But I was feeling that there was something nonetheless, something really huge and beautiful beneath the agony. And I think that that's what was driving me forward. One day, about day 7 or 8 of my hike, again, having not encountered any humans, I looked up and there was this large, horned, hairy brown beast coming at me down the trail. And the trail was this narrow place where there was no escape. It was on a steep slope. And it was running toward me, and there was nowhere for me to go but to scramble up into these really sharp manzanita bushes to get away from it. And in the split second that I was completely flipping out because I was about to die, I knew it was this large brown beast, and I couldn't identify. I'm from Minnesota, so I just started screaming, moose, moose, in the middle of the Mojave Desert. But it was a Texas Longhorn bull that had gone feral and wanted me out of the way. And in my terror of getting away from it, I ran up into these bushes and closed my eyes. And I just carried a whistle with me, and I blew my whistle, and it disappeared. And I realized that I didn't know which direction this bull had gone. Had it gone, was it behind me, in the place that I had passed, or was it ahead of me? And I think so much of what would come to happen in the course of the 94 days that I did end up walking, and I did end up getting myself to the place I wanted to go, was that I really, so much in that first week, what was presented to me was what would be presented to me over and over and over and over again through the course of that journey. and that is that I would never know, which direction that bull was in, and in some ways it was always behind me and it was always ahead of me. That thing that I feared, and that pack, no matter what I did to it, that thing, that weight I couldn't bear, it would always be something I'd have to bear anyway. And I think that so much of what I'd gone out there seeking, seeking to heal my heart and seeking to heal my loss, happened really through the experience of the body, the experience of having to suffer, and having to endure, and having to move forward even though I couldn't. And I think that that's where I'll leave you. Thanks.